kind introduction, which I'll no doubt fail to live up to now, since I will not be solving the puzzle of addiction today. But it's so nice actually to have a chance to be here and present this material to all of you. But of course, I'm going to single out Bruce Alexander in particular, because as you'll know from my abstract, I listened to his ATN seminar earlier in the year. And I'm sure, like many of you, Bruce has always been a bit of a hero for me. And I really experienced that seminar as the throwing down of a gauntlet. So for those of us, which I want to pick up today, that's the aim, is to pick it up today and try to do something with it. So for those of you who weren't at the seminar and haven't listened to it, Bruce began by really chastising the field because we don't have a working definition of addiction. And we don't have a working definition because we can't agree about what addiction is. And he complained that it's the only field he knows where people have to start their talks by defining the main terms, right? Because we don't have this working definition. And I'm now going to quote his words to you and back to him. He said, "We are an intellectual disaster area. We have too many theories. Obviously, most are wrong. They have to be. There's got to be a working paradigm, but we haven't found it. We're stuck." So my hope today is to take some steps towards unsticking us. And I'm really looking forward to a discussion and hearing whether or not you think I succeed. So first, a caveat: quite a lot of what I'm going to say today is by no means original to me. A lot of the ideas are going to be familiar, but what I want to try to do is put them together and motivate them in a way which I hope takes us forward. So it's going to be a kind of big picture talk, and I'll save more of the small details for Q&A. All right, so Bruce is of course right that people define quote unquote addiction differently, right? So addiction is a disease, addiction is a choice, addiction is pathological learning, addiction is normal learning, addiction is an adaptation. That's Bruce's preferred account. And these different accounts are self-conceived as rivals, as competitors. And the core idea I want to have before us today is that we need a framework which doesn't see them as rivals and competitors. It can be, in fact, true that they're all accurate, but only for some people. And what I want to do is try to motivate an idea of addiction and a way of thinking about addiction as science, which really allows that possibility to come into view. So I want to start with something which is so obvious that it really goes without saying, except I think that we often lose track of it in addiction science. And that is just this, that I'm going to talk about drugs. I'm going to talk about drug addiction. A lot of what I say, I think, can apply to behavioral addiction, but I'm going to confine myself to drugs. But if we think about drugs, drug use is absolutely pervasive across human societies throughout history. We use a lot of drugs. And most people who use drugs don't become addicted. But of course, everybody who uses drugs, except for the most extraordinary circumstances, starts out not addicted, starts out using drugs in a much more ordinary, non-notable way. So suppose we ask a question not about addiction, but about ordinary drug use, right? And the question is, well, why do people use drugs? Why do humans use drugs? Well, we don't ask that question because it's so easy to answer that it hardly bears asking, right? We use drugs because they have tremendous value to us. They are means to a range of ends that is absolutely ordinary and intelligible for people to have. And those ends include things like, really deep and varied forms of pleasure and euphoria, relief from all sorts of different forms of suffering, both physical and psychological, forms of enhancement, right, of energy, of cognition, of social connectedness, of sex and sexuality, of spirituality. And of course, different drugs work to secure these different ends differently. So some things are better for pain relief, while some things are better for heightened sociability and sex, while some things are better for cognitive enhancement. So if you just take up the basic folk psychological perspective that we all use pervasively to explain and predict ourselves and each other, we know perfectly well why people take drugs, right? The reasons, if varied, are obvious, and any costs associated with drug use appear more than balanced by the benefits that accrue from use. So why start with that? Because of the contrast. The answer is because of the contrast it gives us with addiction, right? Addiction occurs precisely when it looks like the reasons for using drugs run out. And from the same folk psychological perspective, we can't just see why someone is using drugs anymore, right? And that's because the balance between costs and benefits looks like it's tipped. And there comes a point when drugs no longer appear to be balanced by the benefits, right? Whatever the costs are, that balance no longer exists. Quite the contrary, right? So in addiction, we have this pattern of drug use persisting despite really heartbreaking, life-shattering costs. And those can include things we're all familiar with, right? Loss of friends, family, mental and physical health, housing, social status, in jurisdictions that criminalize drugs, right? Loss of basic freedom, right? That's a risk of use. And yet people keep using. So the question that raises for us is why, right? Why are people continuing to use drugs in the face of costs like these? Because from a basic folk psychological perspective, behavior that was perfectly intelligible now seems unintelligible. It looks self-destructive, it looks irrational, it looks to violate an assumption we make in explaining and predicting each other, which is that people have a basic concern for their own well-being. So that question, right? Why are people using drugs despite costs that look so destructive to them is really what I think of as the core puzzle of addiction. And as I said at the first, I'm hardly the first to notice it, right? Nick Heather, who may be with us today, I didn't see the guest list, has written about this extensively. It's a question which motivates a lot of behavioral economists, right? People like Ainsley, Racklin, Herrnstein, and Prelak. So it's by no means original to me to see it, but what I want to try to do is use it in a distinctive way to shift how we think about addiction science. And I think that focusing on this puzzle around addiction can do two things that are really important. One is that it can provide us with the definition of addiction. And the second is that it can identify the question that should be driving addiction science and to which any and all theories of addiction should answer. Okay, so let's think about the definition first. So the puzzle gives us a definition by, in effect, demarcating addiction from ordinary intelligible drug use, right? So addiction is a pattern of drug use that has become unintelligible to us, perhaps to the person themselves. And I'm going to say more about the complication of us and the person themselves towards the end of this talk. Now, just a quick note for philosophers in the audience about what I mean by definition here. If we use the puzzle to define addiction, clearly that definition is not what you would find in the OED, or if you asked the man on the Clapham omnibus, the person on the Clapham omnibus, as we say in the UK, right? What I mean by definition here is what Rudolf Carnap called an explication, which is an account of a concept which is completely recognizable as an account of that concept, but which clarifies or precisifies it so that it's better fit for a particular purpose. And the purpose here is scientific and philosophical theorizing. Okay, so I'm going to call it a definition, but the model of definition I have in mind is a Carnapian explication. And what I want to suggest is that if we use the puzzle to define addiction in this way, we first of all say what it is that addiction is, right? It's a pattern of behavior where this puzzle arrives. And second of all, we kind of put a constraint on a theory of addiction because we've said what it is it must explain. It must explain why people use drugs given that the costs of doing so means that they just don't look to be worth it. Okay, so addiction is a pattern of behavior that raises a why question from a folk psychological perspective. And theories of addiction are hypotheses that aim to answer that why question and thereby remove the puzzlement. And so they answer to that question. Now, this is a very simple suggestion. It resonates with the traditional way of thinking about science, which is as fundamentally question-driven, right? We now think of science as data-driven in many contexts. This is a way of thinking of science that is fundamentally question-driven. So we start with a question. In this case, it's a why question, but it could be a different kind of question, a how question or a whether question. In this case, it's a why question. We look for answers. We test those answers for empirical validity, of course, but also, and perhaps especially with why questions, we evaluate them for explanatory adequacy. So the thought here is that science aims not just at truth and accuracy, but at providing explanation and understanding. And that's one of the core aims of science. All right, so suppose you follow me in thinking of addiction as defined by the puzzle, and therefore theories of addiction as providing hypotheses that aim to explain the puzzle. What I want to suggest then is that there are three important upshots which follow from that, and which I'm going to talk about in the rest of this short talk, which really, I hope, together allow us to move beyond the impasse that Bruce rightly identified. So the first upshot, and I'll spend, I think, probably the most time talking about this, is that doing this gives us a way of diagnosing why there is so much disagreement about definitions of addiction from a theoretical perspective. Now, of course, that disagreement can also be driven by like practical concerns, right? Competition for funding. But here I really want to focus on, you know, the theoretical reasons for disagreement and how this way of seeing addiction really helps us diagnose what it might be. Okay, so here's the diagnosis. I think a lot of the disagreement rests on eliding the distinction between explanans and explanandum, right? Or what explains addiction and addiction itself. So what people are doing is they're redefining addiction in terms of what their own preferred, proffered explanation of it is. So they're redefining the explanandum in terms of the explanans. And that is an elision. It's a mistake of reasoning. And I think it harbors within it a kind of essentialism and universalism. So I'm going to try to lay this out for everyone by appeal to the brain disease model in particular, because that has had such a pervasive and in ways pernicious hold on our thinking. But it would apply to any theory of addiction, and I'll say why at the end. Okay, so the brain disease model is what's known as a strong disease model, and the best way to understand what that is, I think, is to contrast it with a minimal or weak disease model. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen for 3 slides. Can you guys see that? Can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just for a few slides to sort of give a visualization, because I think this really helps to bring the contrast between the models into view. So this is a visual depiction of a minimal disease model, which is a model that dates at least to the 17th century and treats diseases as syndromes, so collections of observable signs and experienced symptoms that co-occur in characteristic ways and unfold over time. And the key thing here is that there's nothing more to disease than this, and note in particular, as depicted on the slide, there aren't any connections postulated between the different signs and symptoms, right? So diseases just are a collection of signs and symptoms on a minimal disease view. And indeed, this is the kind of model that we use to diagnose addiction via the DSM and the APA, right? So substance use disorder is diagnosed on the basis of a polyphyletic collection of observable signs and experienced symptoms. All right, so The strong disease model, by contrast, emerged over the 19th century, and it treats diseases as pathological states and processes in the body or the brain that cause the collection of signs and symptoms that are constitutive of syndrome. So the arrows depicted in the slide here represent causation. And, recent medical advances across the 20th century have really cemented this disease model firmly as our kind of default idea of disease. Classic examples would be Mendelian genetic deficits or infectious diseases like COVID. So the brain disease model, at least as characteristically conceived, is a strong disease model, right? So to simplify, I want us just to suppose that the signs and symptoms of addiction just is the pattern of drug use, despite the costs that extend over time, that I've said is determinative of the puzzle of addiction. So we have signs and symptoms here represented by drug use despite costs. And the brain disease model hypothesizes that that pattern of unintelligible drug use is caused by some form of brain pathology. And the brain pathology here is what the disease is, right? So addiction, understood on the brain disease model, is a brain disease, right? That's the fundamental thing it is. And it causes these signs and symptoms, drug use despite costs. So the brain disease model really strikingly contrasts with the idea that addiction is a syndrome, right? This pattern of observable behavior is precisely not what addiction is. It's the effect of addiction. Addiction is underlying brain pathology, right? Brain pathology is not what explains addiction, it's what it is. And if you think of addiction in that way, there are two really important consequences that follow. So the first is that the possibility of asymptomatic addiction opens up, and you might here think of an infectious disease like COVID to make the point, right? So you can have COVID-19 but no symptoms. Why? Well, the symptoms are the effects of the disease. The disease is the virus, right? So you can have the virus and yet have no symptoms. Similarly, if addiction's a brain disease, you can have the disease but no symptoms. Why? Well, the symptoms are the effects of the disease, and the disease is the brain pathology. And that indeed is how organizations like AA and NA have thought about addiction, right? You can be abstinent for years or decades, no drug use at all, therefore no costs from drug use, and yet remain quote unquote an addict, right? So once an addict, always an addict, as the adage goes. Now, the second consequence of the brain disease model of addiction is that it closes down the possibility of addiction in absence of brain pathology, right? Everyone who's addicted must have a diseased brain, whether or not they have any signs or symptoms, right? That's on pain of being addicted at all. So if addiction is a brain disease, you have to have that brain disease to be addicted. So the results of, in effect, eliding the distinction between explanans and explanandum and redefining the explanandum in terms of the explanan, right? Redefining addiction in terms of a particular theory of what explains it is a kind of essentialism and universalism. That's what follows. And I've used the brain disease model to illustrate this because it has such a hold on our thinking. But as I said, I think it holds of any theory that makes the move of redefining addiction in terms of its own preferred hypothesis of what explains addiction. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can sort of be a bit more together again. Has that stopped sharing? Derek, have I stopped?
Yes, you have. Yes, you have.
Okay, great. Just think of it this way. So take a variable. Suppose you hypothesize that addiction, understood as a pattern of behavior, is explained by some X. And then you redefine addiction in terms of X, right? So addiction is X. Well, then there's no addiction unless there's X, right? That's what follows. All other theories of addiction will be false insofar as they're incompatible with X. And indeed, you can sort of even begin to hear the rumblings of the kind of contempt or derision with which sometimes different theorists regard each other, right? Other theories don't even understand what addiction is, right? We can sometimes hear those kinds of complaints. So the first upshot of defining addiction by recourse to the puzzle, this why question, is really, I think, a diagnosis of the impasse we find ourselves in, right? Why we have so much disagreement about definitions. Okay, the second upshot follows directly from this, and it's that we have a way of going beyond the impasse. So suppose we hold steadfast to our thinking about the definition. We hold steadfast to the idea that we define addiction by recourse to the puzzle as a pattern of behavior, drug use that has become unintelligible. And we refuse to redefine it in terms of any theory or hypothesis that has been offered as an explanation of that pattern of behavior. Well, then the door immediately opens to the heterogeneity of explanations, right? To the heterogeneity of explanations of this pattern behavior. Because why would we ever think that any kind of human behavior was only explained by one and only one thing, right? Heterogeneity is the default when we think about understanding human behavior. We're used to multiple explanations. Okay, so for instance, think about diagnosis in medicine. That's an art because the same collections of signs and symptoms can be explained by many different kinds of disease. So suppose you have a terrible headache, extreme fatigue, and a painfully sore throat. And we ask why? Well, it could be COVID, right? It could be strep throat, or it could be something more mundane. It could be something like you stayed out too late drinking last night in a bar which was really noisy and you had to shout a lot to make yourself heard by your friends, right? So the same collection of manifest signs and symptoms can have all these different underlying explanations. And understanding ourselves and each other is a complicated art for exactly the same kind of reason. So to see this, consider a self-destructive pattern of action that has nothing to do with drugs. Suppose there are 3 different people, each starving themselves and risking death. And suppose we ask why. Well, here are 3 different explanations. One person has anorexia. Another person is a political protester, a prisoner, right, who is using the only means they have available to make a point. And the third, say, is a mother living in conditions of extreme poverty who's not taking food herself to give everything she possibly can to her child. Okay, so we have the same superficial pattern, 3 different explanations: anorexia, political protest, and something like poverty and mother's love for their child. So what I want to suggest is that the way to shift the paradigm, the way to begin to provide something that Bruce rightly says is missing, is to be content with the idea that such unity of addiction there is resides at the surface level only, right? The unity is only in the idea that it's this pattern of behavior. And then once we look at explanations, that unity fractures. And we have really deeply heterogeneous explanations of why people keep using drugs despite the consequences in different cases. And that's exactly what we should expect once we've defined addiction this way, right? Different things will be true of different people. And what it means for addiction science is that we can kind of proceed in a less competitive way. So David Epstein has this wonderful phrase, winner takes all, right? And he's urged people to stop a winner takes all attitude where we all have to have the best effect. And then that proves, which theory is the right theory. And the sort of like the metaphor I want to use to sort of flesh out what this sort of shift in our thinking would be is that rather than different theories being in competition with each other, they can be allies and divide and conquer, right? So some theories will apply to some cases and other theories will apply to other cases. But the key to this alliance between different theories is that we refuse to redefine addiction in the terms of any preferred theory. We keep very clearly this fundamental, observable thing that everybody needs to explain in view, namely this pattern of unintelligible drug use. And then we say, well, different explanations, different theories applied in different cases. And that feels a perfectly natural thing to say. All right, the final upshot of defining addiction by this why question that I want to put on the table before us for discussion today is that the line between ordinary drug use and addiction is manifest for what it is, namely as not sharp insofar as it really cannot be drawn except by appeal to context and values. Okay, so to see this point, I just want to begin by briefly considering a distinction which I think everybody here is very familiar with, but which I think is increasingly lost in popular discourse around addiction, which is the distinction between dependence and addiction, right? So people can be, and by dependence here, I'm going to mean physical dependence, where we think of that as defined by withdrawal syndromes. So it really is something we all know that people can be addicted but not dependent, for instance, because they're addicted to a drug where there's no physical dependence, there's no withdrawal syndrome, right? And they can also be physically dependent on a drug where there is a withdrawal syndrome but not addicted. And that could be, in cases where people become dependent on psychiatric medications, which have very strong withdrawal profiles. So if people go off them or their dose is suddenly reduced, they will go into that kind of withdrawal. Or it could be a case of a drug where we often think of addiction as appropriate, like an opioid for chronic pain relief, where actually there's a stable use of that opioid. The person clearly is physically dependent, but the opioid is doing a lot of good in their life. It's managing their pain such that they can live functionally, as opposed to living in a much more dysfunctional way, which they would without the opioid. So in cases like that, we think of a person as dependent but not addicted. Why? Well, the answer is that, again, it has to do with this balance between costs and benefits. They may be dependent, but the benefits of using the drug very, very clearly outweigh the costs. So just as the distinction between what I'm thinking of as ordinary pre-addicted drug use and addiction depends on this balance of costs and benefits, so too the distinction between physical dependence and addiction depends on this balance between costs and benefits. And that's really important, right? Costs and benefits, thinking about how these weigh up is so important to defining what addiction is. But here's the thing, costs and benefits and how they weigh up depends on context and it depends on values. So I want to consider context first. And I'm going to use a classic philosophical thought example to do this. So imagine two single mothers, each with an alcohol problem. And we're going to say, as part of the example, X hypothesis, that they drink identical amounts with identical effects on state of mind and functional capacity. But now we're going to make one mother wealthy and one poor. Okay, so the wealthy mother is able to hire a live-in nanny who takes care of her children, gets them up, dressed, fed to school when she can't. And the poor mother cannot do that. So the costs of her alcohol use are much more significant because of the impact on her family and her children. But ex hypothesis, the level of drinking and the effect on mental state and functional capacity are exactly the same. So insofar as we think that one mother is on a different place on the continuum between ordinary use and addiction from the other, that can only be because of wealth, right? And that's because wealth is a way of protecting yourself against certain kinds of costs that some people have and some people don't. So the first thing to really note and to see the importance of is how thinking of addiction in terms of this balance of costs and benefits really requires us to contextualize those costs and benefits. And then all sorts of factors come into the mix, which really complicate it. Things like costs and things like wealth. Okay, the second thing that is really fundamental to assessing the balance of costs and benefits is values. They can only be weighed relative to a set of values. So I value the experience of drinking enough to make a hangover worth it, say. You hate hangers so much. Being drunk is something that's just really not worth it to you, right? So we have different background values which affect how we weigh these costs and benefits of drinking differently. Now, those kinds of differences are obvious, but they force an incredibly important question, which is whose values, right? Whose values determine when costs exceed benefits? Now, in many cases, that question doesn't arise because the person who's using drugs has a set of values that completely align with those of us who are thinking about that person, trying to understand them, hopefully trying to help them. Right? But in some cases, those value sets may not cohere. And my favorite way of making this point is by appeal to Keith Richards, who notoriously said that he didn't have a problem with drugs, he only had a problem with policemen, right? And Keith Richards was clearly dependent on drugs at various points in his life. And he also clearly did have a problem with policemen, given that he was in fact convicted of possession and sent to prison at one point. But his values surrounding drug use, what he's saying by telling us that he doesn't have a problem with drugs, he only has a problem with policemen. He's telling us that his values surrounding drugs make it the case that whatever the costs he faced around his drug use, for him, they were worth it, right? Society deemed otherwise. His values were not consonant with society's values as expressed by criminalization and policing of drug use. But for him, the costs were worth it. Okay, so you can ask of Keith Richards, well, was he right about this, right? Was he right that for him the costs were worth it? Or was he in denial? And what I want to say is that whatever the actual answer we should give about Keith Richards, the individual Keith Richards in particular, I think the answer that we should give in principle about anyone is clear, right? The set of values we need to be using to weigh costs and benefits are the person's own authentic values, right? Not the values of other people in their society. Okay, so we're putting, in a sense, the person, their own values, what's worth it by their own lights, at the center of diagnosis here, right? We're putting at the center of diagnosis who the person is, who they want to be, what kind of life they see as meaningful. Okay, so that's the theoretical move, but in practice, of course, it's way less simple. And that's because establishing what it means for a set of values to be authentic, let alone which values really are authentic to a person, is incredibly fraught, especially given the influence of factors like denial, right? Like witness that rhetorical question I asked about Richards, right? Is he right or is he in denial? As well as other factors, right? Things like cognitive dissonance, resigned hopelessness. What really are the possibilities for a different life that somebody might have? Or simply the fact that it's perfectly ordinary for people's values to change over time, right? All of these things really, really complicate establishing what someone's authentic, real values are in any particular case where we're concerned about a conflict between our values and their values, or society's values and their values. So I note this because although I think this way of defining and thinking of addiction is incredibly productive for addiction science, it does have what I think of as a true, but a really important to start to note and think seriously about consequence, which is that it makes it the case that there's no sharp line between ordinary drug use and addiction, because whatever line there is can only be drawn relative to context and values. And it's incredibly difficult to say what a person's values are in a case where they're struggling with drugs. Okay, but on the other hand, it also points the way to diagnosing the impasse and overcoming it, right? We diagnose the impasse as basically a mistake of reasoning where people are taking their own preferred theory of addiction to redefine what addiction is. And everybody has to resist doing that. Doesn't matter what your theory is, everybody has to stop doing that. But it also thereby allows theories that would be rivals and competitors to work together much more harmoniously, to divide and conquer, as I put it, rather than act as warring armies, because it can then just become absolutely self-evident that some theories apply to some people and some theories apply to other people. Okay, so that is like the big picture. And I'm just going to take the last 5 minutes to put on the table two explanations of addiction that I personally think get less airplay than they should, and which are incompatible. Not all explanations are incompatible, just to try to give you like the beginnings of some details that will sort of flesh out how this picture could work. So, of course, by far the explanations of the puzzle of addiction that have got the most airplay are things to do with compulsion, craving, loss of control. My own view, for those of you who know my work, is that although this is part of it, they've gotten way too much airplay for their explanatory value, right? That caveat's really important. I think they explain way less than they claim to. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A, but I'm not going to talk about it now. What I instead want to do is talk very, very briefly about denial and self-identity, which I think are two explanations that need a lot more airplay. And they're actually incredibly simple explanations of the puzzle of addiction. So what is denial? So denial is in effect a form of ignorance, right? It's a form of ignorance that's caused by a psychological defense mechanism to protect you against the pain of acknowledging a certain truth. And in the case of addiction, denial typically involves not acknowledging either that you have a problem in your life at all, right? Or that you might acknowledge there's a problem, but not acknowledge that it is caused or maintained by drug use. Okay, so what you're doing when you're in denial is you're blocking, as it were, proper acknowledgement of the costs. Now, any theory of addiction that wants to appeal to denial as part of the explanation faces this really important question: what is denial and how is denial possible? So I'm of course not saying this is a full theory, but I just want to have before us the austerity and elegance of how denial solves the puzzle of addiction, solves the why question, as I've laid it out. And it's this: if you're ignorant of the costs, then of course there's no reason to stop using drugs, because it's all benefits for you, no costs. So it's an extremely theoretically powerful solution to the puzzle, even if of course there's a really big task now, which is to say more about denial and theorize denial properly. Okay, so that's one kind of explanation I think needs more airplay. Here's another: self-identifying as an addict, quote unquote. So I became very interested in self-identity, partially because in my own clinical work, I really came to the view that what was making the difference between people it felt like we could help in group and people we couldn't was whether or not they were able to sort of envisage what their life would be and who they would be without their addict identity. And that really felt like an absolutely crucial variable. If they could, we could help them get better. If they couldn't, they were really stuck. So why? Well, I see an addict identity as typically doing two different things. The first is that quite often that addict identity is connected to a community, right? It's connected to a group of other users where you may have long-standing relations of care and trust and companionship, where for many people there aren't other such relations available to them in our society, which is so stigmatizing and blaming towards people with addiction. So in effect, the addict identity is like a ticket to that community, and if you give it up, you lose that community, right? So that's part of what's going on sometimes with an addict identity. But I think there's something more, which is that in general, those forms of identities, social identities, structure our daily life, right? They kind of set the tasks, the needs, the patterns of life, what it is you do when you get up in the morning, what it is you need to do at the end of the day. And they also give you a fundamental sense of who you are, right? You're an addict. That is something that makes sense, that you can hold on to as part of your self-identity. And if you imagine taking that away without an alternative identity to step into, first of all, what would you do with your life? What's going to fill the time? What are you going to be doing? What's life going to look like? But second of all, who would you be really, who would you be? There's a kind of existential threat that you face. So I think sometimes people are stuck in addiction because they identify as an addict. And without that identity, there's this like really cosmic fear that ensues. So in some sense, this is better the devil you know than the chaos and void of life without any of that familiarity and structure. Okay, so but here's the two things about these two explanations I've just now offered: denial, self-identity. I've not said a lot, but I hope I've said enough at least to begin to render the idea plausible that they might have some explanatory value in giving us better understanding of why people would keep using despite these terrible costs. They're utterly inconsistent with one another. If you're in denial, there's no way you can be self-identifying as an addict, right? So if we want to allow both of these explanations as possible explanations, we have to get over the idea that any explanation ought to apply in a universal way, right? Because these two are utterly inconsistent. And yet I think they're both extremely powerful. And some will be true of some people, and some will be true of other people. And some will be true of no people, right? There are also completely different explanations that might be what's in effect of value for understanding persistent use despite costs in another person's case. So I wanted to just lay those out, both because I really care about giving these alternative explanations more airplay than I think they typically get, but also because I think it's a really clean and powerful way of seeing the value of a paradigm which has a theoretical structure that allows for heterogeneity, that eschews essentialism and universalism in our theory building. So there are obviously a huge number of questions about the big picture that I put for you today, and even more questions about the details of explaining the why question in any individual case. But I think I'll stop now and open it up to discussion, in the hope that I've at least gone some way towards convincing you that the new paradigm we should all be adopting is one of vast heterogeneity, where we see the definition of addiction really is residing at the behavioral level. Addiction is a puzzle of drug use that we and the person themselves indeed find unintelligible. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was fantastic and very thought-provoking. So just for the questions and discussion points, if anyone wants to raise them, please raise your virtual hands if possible, and I will then go to you, I suppose. So the floor is open, as it were.
Derek, is there a way I can see more people? I've not even seen you speak, and I'd sort of really love to.
I think it's people need to share their camera. So if you want to turn your camera on and give Hannah a wave in person, that'd be lovely.
When you speak, at least, so I can see your face.
That'd be nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to kick things off?
Could I ask a question?
Yes, you can, Bruce.
Please, Bruce.
Well, thank you. I will be brief. Thank you, Hannah, for picking up my gauntlet. And of course, it's so important that we learn to talk without accusations and recriminations with each other. And of course, it's so important that we learn not to work from the explanation to the explanans, as explanandum, as you said. Yeah, and that's to me a brilliant way of looking at it. Here's my question. When you read, now you know much better than I, because you're a philosopher, a real philosopher. You know much better than I that this puzzle that you're talking about comes from Aristotle, from his concept of acrasia. And you know that he's dealt with that at length in the Nicomachean Ethics. Mm-hmm. And you know that book way better than I do. But I read that book by Aristotle, in which he talks about the puzzle of addiction, although he doesn't give it that name. And I can't get through it. I don't think he answers his question. I think he raises the question, but doesn't answer it. Now, my question to you is, do you agree that he doesn't answer it? But the subsidiary question to that is, if he doesn't answer it, and if we're struggling with it after 2,000 years later, whatever, 2,500 years later, is it not possible that that question cannot be answered?
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. And I'm of course delighted you liked the talk, because it was in ways so inspired by you and your talk. So that's you made my day. Thank you. I guess I don't think the puzzle of addiction is the puzzle of acrasia, as I think Aristotle defines it. So I think of acrasia as a puzzle of weak will, where you do something against your best judgment, right? And there's a way in which there's two features of it, which I think are quite effective, at least as how we inherited that puzzle from Aristotle. One is that you typically know you shouldn't be doing it, right? So if you've defined the puzzle that way, you've immediately ruled out denial as an explanation of it, because people are in denial, precisely don't know that they shouldn't be doing this, right? So that's the first thing. And the second is that the mover, what's making you do something that you know you shouldn't do, is something like appetitive desire, right? This kind of like temptation. And although, of course, I think sometimes what drives people to use drugs when they know they shouldn't, in the cases where they know they shouldn't, is appetitive temptation. I don't think that's universal, right? I think that kind of picture of the kind of power of drugs to induce this kind of overwhelming temptation is part of the picture you rightly want us to reject when you talk about the demon drugs that grabs us by the nucleus accumbens, right? That was a lovely phrase from your talk at the ATN. So sometimes that's what's going on and sometimes it's not. So the way I define the puzzle as a pattern of behavior, which is really unintelligible, at least at first, from the folk psychological perspective, includes weakness of will, but includes much else as well. So I guess I would reject the idea that we're still, I mean, we may still be grappling with Aristotle's puzzle, but I don't see that puzzle as defining the puzzle of addiction. Different.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we then go to Lee, please?
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for a
Hey,
lovely
Lee.
talk.
Thank you.
Lots to think about as ever. I just wanted to push back on David Epstein's
Yes, that
answer
was his phrase was in a commentary to your fantastic paper. So yes, push back. Okay.
And I mean, in the review process, he wrote that a couple of times, and I kind of refused to do anything about it. It was what it was. I wasn't budging. But the reason I always, I mean, the opposite view, I think, well, what is he actually saying is it's kind of a dodo bird hypothesis. The winner, everyone must have a prize. But the status of a causal variable in addiction is empirically defined by the quality of the evidence that there is. And so you can't just say, oh, everything can possibly play a role in some circumstances, in some different groups here and there, because it may do, but you may have entirely just constructed out of your own imagination.
Sorry, Lee, can you just repeat that, please? You went a bit quiet there.
So, I mean, I totally agree that addiction's multiply determined, but with any one supposed causal variable, you've just got to evaluate the quality of the evidence that exists for it. And it's either going to have good quality evidence or poor quality evidence. And if it's got poor quality evidence, then it's not viable as an explanatory construct. But the most important thing for me is the utility of it. You wouldn't want to construct an intervention around a variable that turns out not to be causal, because you'd be wasting your time. So you do actually need to sort of ascertain the true causal status of different variables and the importance of the role so that you target the right thing. So I wonder where you stood on whether David was right or not still.
So I understand, David, and this may be, so I agree with everything you said, right? I mean, you know, you come up with a hypothesized causal variable, and then the question is, well, are you right or not, right? And, you know, in particular, you don't want to, you know, take the money and run before you've done that serious evaluation of whether actually this is playing an important explanatory role in some cases. I took David's point partially to be that, you know, we use average effect sizes, right? And so there's an awful lot of variables that might be missed because we want, you know, suppose variable X has the largest, you know, average effect size. And then we're like, well, variable X is the winner, but Y might have been actually the only thing at play in these small, you know, a small number of cases. And for those cases, those people, we want to intervene on Y, right? Intervening on X is not going to do anything. So I don't myself see, I mean, obviously, if David, I don't want to put words in his mouth. If he was proposing the dodo bird hypothesis like you, I would reject it. But I saw him as using that catchy phrase to propose something absolutely consonant with what you just said. And if I can just like kind of hit one of the notes in what you said really, really hard, which I think is so important, is that part of what this emphasis on heterogeneity will do is allow for individually tailored care, right? So, I mean, honestly, I think most people with addiction, the way to help them is to lift them out of poverty. That's like, you know, the way of doing it. But if your problem is that you're wealthy in denial, lifting you out of poverty is going to do nothing. We have to help you with the denial, right, in the first instance. So, you know, part of why the heterogeneity matters is not just because it gives us the best theory, but because of the way it allows that theory to dovetail with interventions that are effective in individually tailored care. So that's something that, you know, was in what you said, and which I just think is so important, so important.
So maybe David's in his critique of, I mean, I was criticizing habit theory, and he then said, well, it may exist somewhere in some groups, but if there's no, so he thinks I'm denying, by criticizing habit theory, he thinks I'm denying the multiple determinacy of the problem, which is not the same thing. I'm just simply stating that that one particular causal process didn't seem to have any compelling evidence.
Yeah, good. So I'm very happy with the idea that that was an unfair criticism levied against you, even if it's a good way of thinking of something that's wrong with the way that a lot of addiction science proceeds. And, you know, Lee's read some of my own recent work on habit, so knows that I buy his view that habits are not fundamentally what's explaining addiction once we've theorized them within learning theory. Yeah.
Well, brilliant. I thought your paper, which you alluded to on network analysis and the sort of granularity, is a really excellent empirical avenue into visualization of the problem, because you can actually hopefully track the circumstances of each individual in a constructionist way, to specify what the intervention target should be on an individual basis, but in an empirical way, as opposed to sort of a clinician's sort of intuition, if you like.
Well, you know what? Let's not have those be rivals either. Not that a lot of clinical work is not as good as it should be, but I guess, you know, I think there is something about working with people that can sometimes give you some insight. So, for instance, what I said about self-identity, I would never have considered that without the time I spent in the clinic. So yes, everything needs to be tested, and part of the problem is that people become, you know, clinicians become kind of blinded and you know, committed to their own personal theory of what works and what's going on, and you know, in ways that's not sensitive to evidence, just the way maybe theorists, addiction scientists become committed to their own personal theory as, you know, what the truth about addiction is. But Let's not have a rivalry between clinical work and empirical testing, because clinical work can give you really interesting hypotheses, which then need to go and get tested.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Can we go to our next question, which is, sorry, it's S, I believe. Would you mind just unmuting your mic and then asking?
Sure. So hi, it's Sally Satel. I started to
I
spell
didn't
my name.
recognize you, Sally. Sorry.
Well, that's because I'm an S, but started to spell my name and it cut me off. So thank you. That was just so crystal clear. I guess really just a few comments, if that's okay. I guess the way I reduce my anxiety about this question of what is addiction, or even, as you say, how to explain the self-sabotage, which I agree with you is the core puzzle here, is not even so much theory or alternative theories or a combination of theories, but just what's most productive. And what's that question of what's most productive depends on who you are. If you're a neuroscientist, then of course the level of circuitry and neurotransmitters is probably going to be most productive to what interests you. I'll say, as an aside, that realm hasn't provided anything new in terms of clinical help. All our drugs that we use, I think the last, if you take an inventory from methadone to buprenorphine and naltrexone and whatever, I think the latest point of development was 1986. So they haven't really offered much. I don't mean clinically, but I mean in terms of anything new, despite the promise of the brain disease view, which would be leading to more of those treatments. But anyway, so along with Scott Lilienfeld, we kind of felt comfortable thinking of it. What's the most productive level of analyses? And you referred to levels of explanation, but the same thing. And I always think of a kind of a triangle with the the top again being the neuroscientific view, the most reductionist, then behaviorist, psychodynamic, social, cultural. You get the idea. And also, as you say, that more than one of those levels may be more relevant to one patient at a time, a given patient. They may differ between patients. They will differ within a patient over the course of his or her addiction. And also, again, depending on who you are, those levels have more or less relevance. But if you're the person stuck in the clinical world or the policy world, it's not the neurobiological level that's going to give you the most insight. So anyway, that's how we looked at it. It's really kind of utilitarian, which is the most productive level to think about as a basis for action. I also think I always found it more productive, given my level, which is clinical and sometimes a little policy, but is really to think of addiction more as a symptom than a disease, because it's usually a marker of underlying dysfunction, and it's the difference between, even though there's not a bright line, it's the difference between the person with controlled use and uncontrolled use. And I just wanted to make, if it's okay, one comment also about I don't know if most folks here are overseas or not, but in America, and Hanna probably knows this, there was huge success of a book called Dope Sick, a show called Dope Sick, and I won't get into my commentary about the opioid crisis, but I think if you want to see a distortion of it, you could watch that show. But in terms of blaming everything on a drug company that came in and poisoned people, which I'm not defending. I have no kind words to say about that drug company, but it's a much more complicated picture, as everyone knows. But the concept of dope sick, which is clearly an old one, is also one, I think, bad explanation for why people continue to use. And, it's the idea that you're especially with opioids or alcohol or barbiturates, when people don't use that much those anymore, but would be the same with benzos, that people are in a withdrawal or feel withdrawal coming on, and they want that to stop. And they do, and that's true. And in the very short term, that does explain why they get their next fix, hit, whatever. But, you know, imagine a person I work in a methadone clinic, and occasionally someone will come in and say, I just need to stay on methadone for a short time, and I'll be off in a month and I'll be fine. And that person's kind of his theory of his problem is that if I just don't withdraw, then I'll be fine. And I suppose I don't have any data on this. I don't think there are data on this. How many people fit that description? Sort of, in other words, I'm intact enough to go on, but I find this withdrawal experience so destabilizing that I can't. And if I just have a medication to help me, I'll be fine. And I don't doubt that there are people like that, because every kind of person with every combination and permutation of problem happens in addiction. But in the methadone clinic, granted, it's a selected group of people. You know, if their problem was dope sickness, they'd all be cured, because, you know, within a week or two, you're on the right dose, you're not withdrawing, you're not craving as much, or at least the kind of craving that's provoked by withdrawal. You know, and there you have your problem, which is, you know, well, now we have to understand why you're continuing to use, because a lot of the folks do, not at the level they were when they came in, but, you know, and then we get back to the sort of the symptom view of this. But I find, I guess I just mentioned that because, you know, dope sick is another one of those, you know, really simplistic explanations. And so I thought I'd add that, and also a little clinical color. So thanks.
Thank you. Hannah, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, so, you know, for anyone living in America, it's hard not to be slightly just, you know, head in your hands about how the way everything's supposed to come back down to dope sickness now. So, like, I entirely agree with Sally about the problematizing of, like, the explanatory power of that in American culture, right? But I guess for me, I'm uneasy with the pragmatism, because you might think that actually dope sickness is a really good example of something that is incredibly pragmatically useful given the society we're in America, right? It's really helped, you know, get politicians on board with being less punitive. You know, maybe we'll manage to decriminalize a little bit. It gives a narrative which people think they can understand. It helps, you know, family and friends blame less, even if it has other costs, including to the person themselves, right, to sort of buy into that narrative. But I guess I worry about choosing questions, definitions, theories, constructs pragmatically when the pragmatic context is so defined by, you know, socio-cultural, economic, and political motives and, you know, waves, which mean that things can have pragmatic effects even when they're really, really wrong, conceptually or theoretically. And so, you know, the dope sick way of seeing that is that maybe it helps in the short term to think of it as, you know, dope sick, and then we're going to sort that out, but not in the long term. There's a lot more left to do. You know, in some sense, the brain disease model itself, of course, was, you know, put forward partially because of a belief that it was pragmatically valuable, that it was going to help combat stigma. And the empirical evidence shows that was false, but it was precisely this, like, pragmatic orientation that was part of the motivation for the original model. So that's not to say science is non-pragmatic. I think that's a really naive view of science, right? Like, what's explanatory, what's true? It's very unclear. We can give good accounts for that, which don't involve some kind of pragmatism. But I think we should be cautious by being too quick to allow theories, constructs, ideas to be guided by what looks like it's pragmatically effective, because of the way what's pragmatically effective will be influenced by things which are really pernicious and difficult and incline us towards falsehood. So, you know, I agree with a lot of the spirit, but I don't want to be quite so pragmatic. Not quite so.
Okay, well, I should let someone else talk, but I don't think that, I don't necessarily see pragmatism as an enemy of sort of some theoretical approaches. What's part of the pragmatism is knowing when you need to turn to a theory. But I realize that doesn't sell in, to politicians and to people looking for easy answers. That's for sure.
Thank you very much, Sally. I think Ahmed was next. Although he seems to have disappeared now.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, you're still here. Good, great.
Sorry.
Let me just spotlight you so that people can see you. I can't really. I've only got a small pictures otherwise. Over to you, Ahmed.
I want to thank Hannah for this amazing talk. I'm very interested in her views on the social identity of the addict, how he can see himself and how he can hang to the identity of the addict because the values that gets from it. First, I'm sorry for my bad English. I don't speak English as my first language. I was just reading your paper, Addiction and the Self, and I'm currently reading Nicholas Rose, Inventing Ourselves, and Gerda Reese, a chapter in her book called Manufacturing Addicts, how the views on the brain disease and the Alcoholics Anonymous and NA and AA, how the addicts can see themselves and see the world and hang on to that identity. My question is, what are the societal factors that made this identity that the people want to stay in it, even if it's getting them in troubles and in problems in lives and so on. I think when I read Bruce Alexander's book, there is a historical moment that this identity came to the idea or to the discourse in people, how they perceive themselves and how they see themselves. So, what are the societal factors in addicts to hang on? In my country, in Egypt, 40 or 50 years ago, we are in a traditional country and society, and our identity was so mutual. We all share the same views in life and the same clues and the same ideas and so on. And from 20 or 30 years ago, people became to be very individualized, and they see the difference in everything was so obvious. So I think there is a societal factor that made the people look to themselves as very different identities and so on. So I want to hear your views on that, and thank you for being easy on my English. Thank you.
Please, your English is excellent. Thank you for the question. So, so I'm hesitant to say too much, partially because I would just be speculating, right? In some sense, the question you're asking is a question of social science and history. I'm neither a social scientist nor a historian. So, everything I'm about to say really needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And also with the caveat that I think, although there might be some broad patterns, the explanations are going to be really, really different in different cultures. So I really don't want to say I don't want to be seen as saying anything that might apply to Egypt. The cultures I know best are UK and US cultures. And I'll say a couple of different things about those cultures. So one is that the question about so the way I see theoretically the question is, what is it that makes an addict identity of value, right? What is it about a culture that makes an addict identity of value for that person? What is it about the person's life which makes it of value? And then there's a question, why is it that there's no other identity which could be like a competing value, right? And in relation to the first question, why is it of value? From a cultural perspective, I do think there are things that we just need to be sort of more real about. One is the romanticization and glamorization of drug use. And, you know, drugs are cool and sexy, and they're pleasurable, and your parents don't like you to do them, even if they did them themselves. And so there's a real kind of cultural cachet in using drugs. Many young people. And, you know, so that's part of the cultural context. Of course, then in different cultures too, there's ways in which there can be like literary traditions or revolutionary traditions associated with drug use and addiction, right? I think that's especially true in America, where the beatnik poets and, you know, history of kind of alcohol and drug influenced literature is really deep in the culture. But also then ways in which forms of marginalization and resistance to hegemony and majority culture can be expressed through drug use and participation in drug use. So sort of those are all factors which, you know, for individuals with certain kinds of orientations in a particular time and place might make drug use, and indeed drug use verging on addiction, have a kind of cultural appeal. But then there's this thing that happens, right, which is that societies typically do stigmatize and ostracize people with addiction. So should someone, as a young person, end up down that route, then once the addiction becomes entrenched, and perhaps they are living in a user community and have lost, say, good rapport with their family, or, you know, haven't developed the kinds of identities and skills they might have developed if they hadn't started using 13 and had drugs be so much a part of their lives. You know, so people don't necessarily have other identities to fall back on, and we don't encourage them to do that because of the blame and the stigma. So then there's this kind of dance between the past choices that people have made and what, in a stigmatizing, moralizing of drug use and addiction society, we provide people with as alternative choices. So there's that kind of entrenchment where you can go further and further down that road, and the goods that accrue from an addict identity are less and less available to you through any other identity. So, you know, in those kinds of cases, like, what can society do first to make drugs less desirable and glamorous and romantic, and second of all, to like provide alternative identities? I mean, in ways that's a question of social engineering, but with respect to the first question, I don't really know if it's realistic to say that, you know, there could be social interventions that really reduce the glamour and romance of it. I think most of that public messaging tends to fall quite flat. But I do think we can give better drug education, right? So that's the difference, right? Knowledge and information, and do that at a young age, right? So there's proper drug safety education and drug understanding taught in high school. With respect to, you know, helping people move out of addict identities, I mean, I think some of the mechanisms are things that social justice in any way demands, which is access to employment, access to education, access to housing, and in general, the kind of work towards the welcome and embrace of people who, you know, have had those kinds of troubles, rather than the pushing them away and the kind of desire to keep them out of removed from the rest of society. So, you know, those are two like very broad brushstroke ways in which we might shift things a little bit. But I feel like the forces of culture and history are a bit like the forces of biology. They're quite hard to tame. So I say all of that with a real sense of my own limitations of understanding.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Can I ask a little one then, briefly? So with all you know, we should all love each other theoretically and long live heterogeneity and everything. Can I just ask you to comment on, you know, on the idea that it's sometimes worthwhile to kill off a theory? So for example, the brain disease model has like taken a lot of investment, billions of pounds get spent on it every year, and as Wayne Hall and others have pointed out, to not much therapeutic good. So is there not a risk, if we embrace your heterogeneous approach, that we will just stagnate and poor, Kuhn and Popper would both turn in their graves?
Sure, there's a risk. The brain disease model is a really good example. I might be unique in this group in thinking that it might sometimes be true, right? So, honestly, I don't think we know what we mean by brain disease because we don't have a good, brain disease is going to be defined by some kind of, neurological dysfunction. We need a good theory of normal function to be able to say what dysfunction is. I don't think we have one. I do think it's clear that there are some long-term chronic effects of drug use on the brain. I don't want to rule out that we should think of that as dysfunction at some state for some people. And here would be another piece that needs to be there for, in those cases, addiction to be explained by a brain disease, that really is the core causal variable as opposed to something else, right? So it's perfectly possible we have brain pathology, and yet that's not fundamentally what's explaining a person's drug use. Something else is explaining their drug use. So for instance, if we lifted them out of conditions of poverty but kept their brains the same, they would stop using, right? That's perfectly conceivable. It's an empirical question whether it's true. So I guess in general, I think I'm kind of against taking stances out of a sense of risk of what the consequences might be if we think that actually that stance is most likely to be true, right? I want us to be guided by truth and do our best to sort of get a proper picture and then think about how to communicate it and how to work with it. And I don't deny that the brain disease model has done so much harm, and things that right now, to get funding, need to be a brain, you need to sort of show that you are an advocate of that model. I myself have received quite a lot of contempt from neuroscientists who do things sometimes like walk out of my talks when I question that addiction might, in all cases, be a brain disease. People get very angry. So it's not like I don't think there is a real cost to the dominance of that model, and even giving it a little bit of airplay could feed that cost. But I really don't know that it's in all cases false, and I would just feel bad, claiming I did. So I don't know, Derek, if that's the beginning of an answer to the question. I don't want to deny the risks, but I don't think we should be so motivated by risks as opposed to just everybody, trying to model doing the theoretical work and the empirical work and the clinical work as absolutely well as we possibly can. And then worrying about the consequences from the position of really having done our best to just get that right.
Brilliant, thank you. Can I go to Tom next, please? Tom, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. You propose defining addiction as unintelligible substance use. Would you say more about what assumptions might be required for that definition?
Yeah, so this is a place for me where I'm actually really actively thinking, so I'd welcome thought. So I think the most natural way people tend to frame this kind of behavior is as irrational, right? Where it looks like the use persists despite a violation of rational self-interest. And so use is irrational. That would be like a behavioral economics way of thinking about it. And I've become really unhappy with that way of thinking about it for two reasons. One, I think that saying, it's fundamentally a piece of behavior that's irrational carries its own stigma, actually, that there's something about the way we use charges of irrationality to beat people up, which is really problematic. So I'd like to avoid that if I can, while nonetheless remaining accurate. But the second is that I think folk psychology, which I really, as a philosopher of mind, hold very dear, right? This is this basic set of psychological generalizations that we just use in this very fluid way to make sense of what's going on in our own lives and the people around us all the time. I really think it has an incredible explanatory power, A, and B, it actually has a lot of scope for so-called irrational behavior. There's quite a lot of irrationality we don't have trouble explaining at all. We don't find unintelligible at all. And indeed, if we go back to Bruce's original question about Asia, that can sometimes be a case in point. I mean, I'm on a diet. I know I shouldn't eat the chocolate mousse. Why do I eat the chocolate mousse? Not in my interest. Well, it's just so tasty and I really want it. And, I just decide to go for it or whatever. I mean, there's no difficulty there in explaining irrationality. So the notion of unintelligibility here is really supposed to be relativized to folk psychological theory of behavior, which includes quite a lot of wrinkles in human behavior, things that are very far from rational ideals. And I guess I think that, and so it's part of why, in some sense, the severity of the consequences that come from addiction are really important here to keep hold of, right? It's not just like, the severity of me eating that chocolate mousse, right? People use by the fact they know it's killing them. Their kids have been taken away. They were in jail for 5 years, and yet it persists. So there's really something like fundamental there about the way in which use is just such violation of, one's own sense of well-being, right? As we typically think people care to themselves. So that's what I'm kind of going for with intelligibility or unintelligibility. I appreciate it needs more filling out, but I'd be kind of curious to hear whether that helps you understand it better or perhaps allays some of the concerns that might have been in the background of your question.
Well, I would have used irrational as equivalent. So I'm working to understand your distinction. I think we assume that all individuals seek to grow and to secure themselves better in the world, to survive better. So yes, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So what I propose to do now is I propose to go to Paul next. Then I'll go to Sally, and then I'll go to Bruce for the final question. Okay, I hope if there's any more burning questions, please put up your hands now, but we're going to stop at 5:05. We started 5 minutes late. So Paul, can you come next, please?
Okay, thank you. I want to address the identity thing that you raised, which I think is, when I started smoking, I was 10 years old, and 95% of the men in my community were smokers. So it was a natural thing to move in to become a smoker. And afterwards, people would ask me, "Are you a smoker?" And I would, while I was still smoking, I would say, "Yes, of course, I'm a smoker." But nobody at the time had any idea of it being an addiction or terminating it as an addiction or anything like that. Right now, that the use in adults in Holland has dropped to about 20%. Almost all the people think that smoking is an addiction. So how do you apply your ideas out of the clinic to these nicotine addicts in the wild, so to speak?
Okay, so
Nice, Paul.
thank you. So I actually think in ways like nicotine addiction is one of the drugs where nobody's theory works particularly well. Okay, so I'm going to just put that out there. It's like the anomaly for everyone. So part of what happened with smoking is that we learned it was bad for you, despite really concerted efforts by the smoking industry to block the public from learning what science had shown, right? So, but if you think back to, I've just had a very significant birthday myself. I don't want to make any aspersions about anyone's age, so I don't know quite when you started smoking. But if I think back to, my mother or my grandmother's time, everybody smoked. My grandma smoked all the time. Certainly when she started, nobody knew it was bad for you. In fact, people were often told it was good for you, right? It was perfectly normal. So there, actually, I see why people keep smoking in an interesting kind of way on the model of denial that I put forward. They're ignorant of the costs. Now, not because they're in denial, but because no one knows. We just haven't done the science that have established that there are these long-term health consequences. everyone does it. Nobody knows there are these long-term health consequences. Of course you smoke. It's that simple, right? It's like, you know, eating yogurt for breakfast or something like that. Then we learn there are these consequences. Then there's this battle to educate the public against, you know, the tobacco industry's financial interests, and nobody ever learning that there are these consequences. But of course, at that point, it's quite late for many people who find themselves addicted to smoking. So that's like part of the story, at least of the genesis of smoking addiction within a certain generation, right? Much less so like my daughter's generations, they tend not to smoke. They're going to do anything they vape because they've at least learned there's a difference between, you know, tobacco and nicotine and the health consequences of each. But I also think, so I started thinking about self-identity, both because of my own clinical work, but also because, like in a footnote in Rob West's Theory of Addiction book, he's got this anecdote about an informal study he did, which really, really stuck with me. And the study is something like this. I think he had like, I don't know, a small number of participants, maybe like 10 people in the clinic. And they were all going on some smoking cessation. They were long-term smokers, very serious smokers. They were all going on some, you know, having some smoking cessation intervention. And he asked them the week that they quit whether they identified as smokers or ex-smokers. And half of them said ex-smokers and half of them said smokers. It's like a few days of abstinence. Okay, so the people who identified as ex-smokers are wildly optimistic, right? Like there is really no empirical evidence at that point, having smoked for 40 years, given, you know, relapse rates when people quit, that after 3 or 4 days of not smoking, you have any right to claim you're an ex-smoker. But this extraordinary thing happened, like I think it was 6 months follow-up, 100% of the people who said they were smokers were smoking, while 50% of the people who said they were ex-smokers were not smoking. Okay, so it looked like that identification as an ex-smoker had this effect, right? That's the natural thing. That something about identifying as an ex-smoker helped you become an ex-smoker, right? And you know, there's been Sarah Best and Albury and Frings have done some really wonderful work about sort of ex-addict identities in relation to recovery since Rob did that seminal funny anecdotal study, which captured me however many years ago it was that I first read A Theory of Addiction. So I guess in ways part of the genesis for the ideas around self-identity really came with transposing that, right? Like, so if an ex-addict identity is helping you recover, what does an addict identity do in helping you to keep stuck, right? To keep using. And interestingly, a lot of the smokers I've spoken to really feel their smoking identity matters to them. Like on the one hand, it's an identity that's quite easy to give up because typically you can be a smoker while being a whole bunch of other things, right? So if you're a smoker, you could be very professionally successful, you could be a parent, you know, you could have all these hobbies. There are many other things that kind of can be part and parcel of your life. So you kind of know who you would be if you're not a smoker. But at least the people I know, there's something about smoking, some of my female friends in particular, which really like embodies this bad girl image. And especially for the women who really are professionally successful and mothers and in some sense have really like, you know, stepped into a way of being in the world that has nothing bad girl about it, those cigarettes and that identity as a smoker really matters. So even though smoking is different from the other drugs, I do think of a smoking identity as something that can be incredibly powerful for people.
Okay, thank you. Sally, can you keep it brief, please? It's over to you.
Okay, yeah, very brief. Just to throw out, not even to respond to, but I think that something that makes us have to think hard about our theories or our practicalities are the incidence of implantations, brain implants in people who are addicts, and because that would certainly appear to fortify the brain disease model. I don't think it really throws that much of a wrench in it because so many of these people like had their anxiety treated at the same time, and I would say the anxiety may have been, you know, driving the drug use. We don't know on follow-up how well these people will do. They all get a lot of therapy. The placebo effect could be incredible because they think I'm part of science. That's my new, that gives my life a bit of meaning. And that's also something that may have helped me quit. But I just throw that out as kind of a natural experiment in challenging some of these theories. That's it.
Thanks, Sally. 1 minute response from you, Hanna.
Oh, no, I just agree. I mean, most of the data in favor of a theory is so not well controlled, and that's probably especially the brain disease model, so I totally agree.
Brilliant. Okay, Bruce, you threw down the gauntlet, which Hanna picked up. So it's the last question of today's webinar goes to you.
Well, my questions have mostly been asked by other people. I wanted to just say to Hanna, thank you. That was brilliant, and it's your attitude, your positive attitude. I think is just so important for our field that I just cherish it. And I do have a question. Can I ask it, or should we just let it go at that?
Go for it. Go for it.
Go for it. I want to hear it.
You used a very interesting example about 3 people who were starving themselves. One had anorexia, one had was on a hunger strike, and one was a very brave mother taking care of her child by giving her child all the food. And you said, well, there's an indication that we really need different theories. And I want to ask you about pragmatism. I mean, of course, those are different explanations, obviously, as you pointed out. But pragmatically, we know there's they all have something in common, which is that they're all doing something for a purpose, including the person who's defined as anorexic. They're using that as a kind of a manipulation. So pragmatically, it's very useful to say, well, we understand that when a person starves themselves, they are they're manipulating, they're doing something purposeful, even though we know there are exceptions where the person's physiology just takes away their appetite. There is such a physiological condition, I know, but we leave that out for pragmatic reasons, because we want to say we understand a person starving themselves as a human action of desperation. Why not be that pragmatic about addiction?
Why would you want to leave out? I didn't know that there is a physiological condition. That could be why someone's starving them. Why do we leave that out? Why isn't that sitting alongside the others? So there's a 4th person who's doing it for that reason.
Well, I mean, you see it in people dying, for example. The day before they die, they stop eating. Often this happens, and we don't think it's purposeful. We just think the system is shut down. But why would we leave it out? Because it's pragmatic to say, well, our focus is on understanding why people are addicted, or understanding why people are starving, and for the most part, in the instances that are important in our lives, it's a purposeful thing, and that's my point. That's my question.
Okay, I got it. I think. So I think the answer to that. So if you'll permit me to adopt the example a little bit, like so suppose we did learn that there was a condition that kids could be born with, such that they just didn't eat and they'd starve to death unless, because they didn't have something natural in their body, a bit like when your body shedding. So, but it was very, very rare, and these other explanations were much more statistically typical, right? I wouldn't want to leave out the possibility of that other explanation. Certainly, if you're the parent of that child, right? You want people to be thinking of that explanation because you want there to be interventions and attention to your child who's got that problem. And so I guess in some sense, like, I would like us to be able to say, we shouldn't leave it out, but what we should do is say, look, on the whole, this is not where we start, right? We start with the idea that the behavior is purposive. Behavior is something to be explained by reasons. And then the question is, what are the reasons in these different cases? But we don't want to deny that in 1% of cases, or whatever it may be, there's an explanation which is non-purposive, right? Which isn't explained by appeal to someone's reason. And I guess what I kind of think has happened is that, so that I take the brain disease model to be an explanation which bypasses reasons. And that's why so many of us are so upset by the pernicious effect that it's had. Because to help people, when the behavior is explained by reasons, you need to engage with those reasons and understand them. And that's what the brain disease model utterly fails to do. But I guess I would feel that, you know, if in 1% of cases, that's the right explanation. I'm not saying it is, but if it is, what I'd want us to say is, you know, we are not starting with the brain disease model, but it's really important we don't, you know, pretend it doesn't exist, because in 1% of cases it does, on the model with, you know, this idea of the explanation of starvation maybe being physiological in 1% of cases. So, I mean, there's pragmatics and there's pragmatics. I mean, if adding that extra clause is something that's going to cost a wholesale transformation of policy to say, so we could make progress that we won't, and we can nonetheless help that one individual just by making sure everyone clinical keeps it in mind, then I'm not against being pragmatic. But I'd like to think that, you know, I mean, this is, you know, of course, I'm about saying the ideal world, and I'm a philosopher, and the ideal world is not thinking pragmatically. But it's like we shouldn't have to say that, right? We should be able to say to people, look, we got things back to front. Possibly there's never a situation where the right explanation just has to do with brain pathology. If there is, it's in a minute amount of cases. We're not going to pretend that's not possible for those cases, because we want to help those people as much as we want to help everyone else. But you're totally destroying your ability to help everyone else by this sort of blind faith in this model, which is an irrational model, right? It's a model which just doesn't think about reasons at all. So maybe it's just my optimism, which makes me think, like, why can't we be in a world? Why can't we make the world such that that's what we could say? But that's, you know, that's where I'd like to go, right? Like, why can't we say it that way? We certainly shouldn't pretend it's not true to ourselves if it is true that 1% could be non-purposive.
Thank you, Hanna.
Thank
Well,
you. I want to hear your comeback, Bruce, but I won't.
No, there's no comeback today. You can have the last word, Hanna, because you deserve it, because it was a brilliant talk and a really brilliant session afterwards as well. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank everyone else who turned up for participating, and I hope to see many of you again at the next webinar, which is yet to be organized. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hanna.
Thank you, everyone. It was a really great conversation. Thank you so much.